Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Veronica. In this video, we're going to focus on fragrances that represent the 90s to me, some of the big perfume icons of the 90s. I would like to pause and ask everyone to drop in the comments when you think of 90s fragrances, what comes to mind for you? I'm sure we could talk about 100 fragrances. I've narrowed down the list here. I think I have 16 to share with you. I won't be going over notes or we'd be here forever. Just want to give you some quick memories and impressions from these fragrances and hope that you enjoy this trip down memory lane. There are a number of what I call transition fragrances, meaning they were released in the late 80s and had their big moments in the 90s. There's a body of them. One that comes to mind is Rumba. Rumba. This was a category of fragrance that was just loud, almost gaudy, like it brought the 80s big hair and shoulder pads into the 90s with it and kicked in a bunch of spice. Now, spicy isn't an accord that's associated with this Rumba fragrance, but I get it fair and square in here. This is a fragrance that has over 30 notes. That's a lie. There's 29 notes listed on Fragrantica. Where did she get 30 from? No one knows. Anyway, it's loud, it's huge, it's a bunch of everything and nothing all at once because there's so much going on in here. If you look on Fragrantica, it tells you that this is sweet and floral. I don't get anything sweet out of here. I get really super condensed florals and I get a heavy animalic note out of this. So I'm thinking about this as one of those bridge fragrances that brought some of the 80s animalic nature into the 90s. Next, I'll quickly touch on a couple of fragrances that are 90s through and through. In fact, they helped shape the era a bit in terms of the mix between perfume and pop culture or mass culture. And it is the CK fragrances from Calvin Klein. The first one was CK1. And then I have CKB as well. These were some of the first fragrances that were marketed as purely unisex, at least from the 80s forward. There's a whole history behind how fragrances, whether they had a gender or not, earlier in the century. We'll do something like that another day. But in terms of our more modern times, if you will, these released in the 90s were part of that sort of gender bending category of fragrances. I don't know why I'm... What are you doing, Veronica? What does this mean? Get yourself together, girl. Anyway, these fragrances, I remember wearing them quite a lot during my college years. If it wasn't one, it was the other that I was wearing. I would douse myself in them. They're fairly light fragrances and fairly inoffensive and definitely gender neutral, neither leaning feminine nor masculine in terms of the traditional sense of how notes come across to people. CK1 and CKB, iconic 90s fragrances. For those of us that were still young in the 90s and still making our way through this world in terms of financially, one option that people enjoyed were the Jovan fragrances that could be purchased at convenience stores and so forth. I happen to have white musk. There are several in this line. I think there's a handful of them that represent to me the 90s. This is like the poor man's cologne of the 90s, poor woman's cologne. It is a cologne concentration. And these are ones that you could douse yourself in and go on about your day and know you would smell nice, but you hadn't spent a fortune on your fragrances. There's no denying that one of the iconic 90s fragrances is Escape from Calvin Klein. It's classified as a floral aquatic. And yes, there are a lot of florals in here. There are a lot of notes in here in general. But this, and it says aquatic, which you tend to think of something like watery. I would even call this like an aquatic oceanic fragrance. It reminds me so much of the ocean for some reason. It's at the same time sweet and salty. A really bizarre fragrance that's so challenging to describe. It's got notes galore, including some fruity notes like melon, and I think there's apricot, apple, orange, and then a lot of herbs. There's a lot happening in here. And it's a really pungent fragrance. It's one that you spray on and it projects far and it lasts a long time. Such a distinctive smell from the 90s, Escape. While we're on the topic of floral aquatics, This one screams 90s. This is an eau de toilette concentration of L'eau de Issey from Issey Miyake. I am nursing this bottle. This is an original from that time period. And I love this. This reminds me of people just smelling wonderful, like getting ready to go out to an event, spraying this on, and it like completely elevates the person to this whole new level. Really a beautiful fragrance, also floral. What's going on in here? You've got lotus, freesia, cologne, a lot of things happening, sandalwood, cedar in the base. But what I get out of this is just this beautiful aquatic, even a little bit oceanic as well, like the Escape with florals on it. That to me is one of the most elegant fragrances out of the 90s, and a huge fragrance, a powerhouse beast mode fragrance from the 90s. L'eau de Issey. Kind of, sort of in the same family, but not really, because it takes a left turn into floral territory, is Pleasures from Estee Lauder. This fragrance brings back so many happy memories, just like Escape and just like L'eau de Issey. This reminds me of being in college, being young and happy with your whole life ahead of you. My girlfriends had this fragrance and we all thought we were really fancy when we spritzed this on. This is absolutely floral. There's a lot of notes in here, and it also has some greenness, but is a pretty and feminine fragrance in comparison to the others, which are just more sophisticated. This is a bit more soft and girly, yet loud at the same time. Kind of hard to describe, just like the era of the 90s. Pleasures by Estee Lauder, a beauty still to this day. One fragrance that's quite a departure from all the other fragrances that I'll talk about today, but is worth mentioning, although I need to admit that I just recently became familiar with this fragrance. It is Joop Laban. Beautiful vanilla-based fragrance. It's a little ambery, a little woody, super comforting, a great relaxing fragrance, one that could easily fall into like that boyfriend category where it feels like a boyfriend's hug, if you will. And it could easily be a warm, cozy, sweater weather kind of vanilla fragrance. It's also clean smelling at the same time, like a clean, simple, elegant, woody vanilla. Joop Laban came out in the late 80s, but had a big moment in the 90s and is having a resurgence today, particularly from fragrance lovers who are becoming reacquainted with it. Gorgeous fragrance. Who remembers this next fragrance? I don't have good memories about it because I remember it being super cloying, like way too sweet, way too floral, way too overpowering. And that's saying a lot because all of these fragrances from the 90s are really quite overpowering. But this is iconic also from the 90s. It's Red Door from Elizabeth Arden. I only have a little one here. It's huge florals. I mean, and it takes over a space. I remember this being really super grown up, and I had a friend in high school who wore it. And I remember thinking, woo, that's like what people called an old lady smell or whatever. I don't, think about things in terms of being old lady now. As I get older, I have a lot of appreciation, if you will, for fragrances that people sometimes categorize as that. But this is a big fragrance. I don't know that I like this to this day. I do plan to do a full day wear soon. I recently got this little one just to see if my memory of it is the same. But I remember being overwhelmed by Red Door from Elizabeth Arden and it being too grown up. Was it nice? Yeah. Was it too much for me then? Yeah. Would it be too much for me today? I'm not sure. We'll have to see about that. One that was released in the 90s, but I didn't catch onto it until the early 2000s. And I have an original bottle of it, and I will treasure this. I nearly sold it. This is Cabotine, an original formulation. We call it the broccoli top. You see the color of the juice. That's how long I have had this. It's super heavy floral. And I get a little bit of citrus out of this, even though it's not listed as an accord. And it's really green, like a heavy green floral with a touch of citrus fragrance. Very overpowering if you spray too much. This is one that you want to do very lightly, but it's such a distinctive smell, one that you have to be in the mood for because it is pungent. It's like a thick smell, thick green, thick florals, but also a happy fragrance. It's a little bit sunshiny at the same time. Cabotine. Speaking of green fragrances, one of the queens of green is Eden from Cacharel. What a bizarro fragrance, but in a way that I like. This is a fragrance that even smelling it is like, woo! It's strong, and pungent. Super green. Green to what I call an alien extreme, like an out of this world, really concentrated green. Think of green fragrances and what makes them green. And imagine taking that accord, multiplying it times 10,000, and then squeezing it down to concentrate it into its most powerful form. That's what you get out of this Eden. Also with this little slight like plasticky note in the background that makes this almost too much. I still haven't done a full day wear on this because I'm scared of it. I had it back in the day and recently came back into a bottle of it, and it is strong. Yeah, just strong. Very, very green to me with nothing else to it. Another green fragrance, but one that is a lot more wearable for me and less intimidating than Miss Eden here, is Safari by Ralph Lauren. This is one that I wore all the time, it feels like. In the 90s, you couldn't tell me that I didn't smell amazing with this thing on. It's very aromatic. It's got some florals in there as well, but it's a very heavy green fragrance with some dryness to it. So it has a woodiness, and it's called Safari. So I can't help but think of like a dusty safari trip out onto the plains of somewhere in Eastern Africa. I had this beautiful trip years ago, 3 weeks in South Africa, where I had the opportunity to go on to a number of animal reserves, sometimes traveling by Jeep and other times actually traveling on foot with a guide that had a rifle on him and all of that. It was quite a beautiful experience, really close to nature. And this reminds me of those experiences. The name is suggestive of that, but there's also the greenness in here, which reminds me of being out on the plains with the green grass underneath, but also the grass sort of baking in the sun. So there was like this hay-like note that came up from the grass, and this dryness and woodiness in the air as well. And that's what this reminds me of. That's what this evokes for me, even though when I wore it in the 90s, I thought I was just being sophisticated because I had a Ralph Lauren fragrance on. It wasn't I special. But today, this has different meaning for me, and I really do love this gorgeous bottle here. If we think of safari as being out on the plains on safari, then Nude from Blass is the cousin of this that was out in the desert. This is another green, woody, aromatic fragrance, but a lot even drier to me than the safari version. In fact, this is like a desert dry. When you sniff this, it makes the back of your throat dry in a good way. I really like this. This is a gorgeous fragrance that is super duper hard to describe. Also powdery, a little bit aldehydic. I just love this. It's unique and it's different. I went through a period where I hated this because I wore a bunch of it. Probably about 10 years ago or so, I wore a lot of it. I didn't wear this in the 90s, to be honest. I came upon it in the early 2000s and went through just about a bottle of this, sold it off when I had it, or gave it away. I don't remember when it, but it was maybe at about a third left, and I abandoned that bottle and recently came back in contact with it. And I'm so glad that I did. I have a whole newfound appreciation for Nude from Blass, another 90s icon. We've got 3 fragrances to go, and those of you who were old enough to wear perfume in the 90s, you'll remember these. Why don't we start with Dune from Christian Dior. This is the Eau de Toilette concentration. I think it's discontinued. It's getting very hard to find. Another one that reminds me somewhat of Nude from Blass. I kind of have them in the same family, if that makes sense. This is another heavily woody fragrance, very distinct, very strong, a fragrance that is best worn in super cold weather, although I think it also has a place in super high heat. I'm just not daring enough to do that. In fact, I've been eyeballing it this summer and thinking, should I try it? And I haven't. But I really associate this with smelling best when you have on a big, like chunky cable net sweater in the middle of winter and you want this woody, dry, cozy fragrance. This also has some sweetness to it. Oh, there's just something special about this. It has amber, an amber accord, warm and spicy, also powdery. In the base, it has a beautiful sandalwood and vanilla. This is just gorgeous. And it's one that, although I wore it in the past, I have so much more appreciation for it now. I always thought it was this heavy, cloying fragrance in the past. Now that I am of a more mature age, I have a completely different appreciation for this. This is another one that I wore in the past and then just abandoned my bottle because I became overwhelmed with wearing it, and I'm ready for it again. Dune, Christian Dior, welcome back to my life. Now, we're down to the final two. And these two could really battle it out for like the queen of the 90s fragrances. But I got to reserve that spot for my beloved. You'll hear about her in a second. She's waiting patiently in the wings. But let's talk about Organza from Givenchy. Look at this bottle. I don't even know where to begin in describing this bottle, but just take a look at it. Is this one that I wore in the 90s? No. Do I remember other people wearing this? Yeah. This is a very, very mature, sophisticated fragrance, very heavily floral, also woody and heavy vanilla. This can be super cloying if you're not in the mood for it. In fact, I don't know if I'm ever going to be in the mood for this, but I want to try it. I want to wear it knowing that I'm at a different phase in my life, but I'm going to need to wait until winter. This is loud, in your face, elegant, mature woman, all at the same time. It's all those things. It's rowdy and it's mature. It's unapologetic. It's bombastic. It's come hither. It is I'm here, love me or leave me. It's I'm sexy, Jessica Rabbit, and everything in between. Organza by Givenchy. You need to have an appreciation for these enormous, big, vanillic white florals to appreciate Organza, or you'll sniff this and be completely turned off. But I think that it is beautiful in its own right and I can't wait. I don't know why I said I can't wait. I can wait, but I'm going to wait till winter to try this one out and let you guys know what I think. Undeniably one of the classic 90s fragrances. But the queen of the 90s, to me, is none other than my beloved Amarige, also by Givenchy. I've been through several bottles of this. It is one of my very favorite fragrances, in my top 5, maybe the top 3, along with Alien and Narciso. This is somewhere in that top 3. Sometimes this is number 1, sometimes it's number 2, sometimes it's number 3. My husband loves this on me. This is, to me, one of the most beautiful, most elegant, classiest fragrances that a woman can wear. It's another heavy white floral, has some yellow florals in this. There's a tuberose and a gardenia note in here, a ylang-ylang jasmine. The base is woody, sandalwood, vanilla, amber, tonka bean, musk. I had a hard time with this when it came out. I had a hard time with this in the early 2000s because it is so much of what it is. This is another unapologetic, very heavenly, womanly. What am I trying to tell you? Heavenly, womanly. Bloopers. Another unapologetic, heavily, not heavenly, womanly fragrance. Very sensual, very sexy. This is one, if I ever do a video about fragrances that men go crazy over, this is certainly going to be in it. I have never worn this without several men complimenting me on it. This is in times when I was in an office, not during my COVID days. COVID days when I'm working from home, it's husband and the kids saying, you smell great. Amarige, absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, elegant. Nothing else like this. I know this smell anywhere. I've never smelled another fragrance that comes close to Amarige for me. Halo. Those were my 90s fragrances. What did I leave out? What would you have included in the list? I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, friends.